In terms of the goal, 30% by 2030, the biggest obstacle is going to be that those repositories of biodiversity, which have the most potential for us to set aside and preserve, are in developing countries where it's simply not possible for biodiversity to be set aside without financing to ensure that those countries are compensated for what they give up in development.
Hello, I'm Paul Beckwith, and we're in Montreal at COP15, the Conference on Biodiversity, and this is a Climate Emergency Forum video, and I've got with me the Member of Parliament and Green Party leader, or rather co-leader, Elizabeth May. So we're going to talk basically about, get Elizabeth's view on how successful or non-successful COP15 is, and also you were in Egypt, I believe. Oh, you weren't. Okay. So we'll stick to. Okay. Well, maybe we can get some of your impressions on that COP as well. So how is this one going so far?
This one is strange. For those who haven't participated in United Nations conferences of the parties, and the Conference of the Parties refers, of course, to nations. Any country that signs and ratifies a treaty is called a party. So a Conference of the Parties is kind of like our a global parliament on that topic. So in terms of the climate treaty, we just finished, as you mentioned, Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, COP27. Here we are in Montreal with COP15 for biodiversity. Both treaties were signed and ratified by Canada at the same time. The treaties emerged from the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. So clearly biodiversity has had less funding, less support, less prominence. I can't say that the climate COPs, through prominence and frequency, have achieved what needs to be done. In fact, we've gone the opposite direction since the Framework Convention on Climate Change was first signed in Rio in 1992. Humanity has emitted more greenhouse gases than between the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution till now. But this COP, generally there are 2 weeks of negotiations, whether you're talking about a climate COP or a biodiversity COP. The first week is always lower level diplomats doing, not to say they're low level, but they're not elected. They try to prepare a text and hand it off to ministers. Today is the handoff day at this COP. The texts have been worked on as far as diplomatic or bureaucratic level people can go. Now ministers are going to come in, and there are many issues that are not close to being resolved. So it could go either way. This could be a spectacular failure. This could be a moderate success. It's too soon to tell because the ministers are just starting their work today.
So it's like a basketball game. You play for 2 hours and the game's decided in the last minute, generally. I hear a lot of talk about this 30-30 target. So the idea is protect 30% of the land surface, 30% of the ocean surface by 2030. Like that metric, it's hard for me to get my head around a bit, because does this mean each country is supposed to protect 30% of their land area? If so, if it's sort of like a circular land area in the middle of the country, it will do absolutely no good, because climate is changing, temperatures are increasing, rainfall patterns are changing. So the only geometry of land area that makes sense to protect, it would be, say, a vertical slice through the country, and then plants and animals can migrate northward as things are warming. Are they even thinking of things like that, or are those details too much at this stage?
No, people do think about exactly what it means to try to preserve biodiversity in a climate crisis, also recognizing that while we're very focused on the reality that long term the climate crisis is the single largest threat to species, the single largest cause of potential extinctions, including of us, But short term, we're hacking away at the forest, and Canada's no exception. We're cutting through our old growth forest. We're still poisoning biodiversity through our use of pesticides, and we're still very keen on pursuing minerals underground and getting the forests out of the way to get them. So if you look globally, for instance, one of the things I love about being in the Green Party, by the way, is that the access to talk to colleagues in other countries. So, and they're often elected and serving in cabinets. So, and I was talking to an elected colleague from Finland who was saying the Finnish government recognizes that if they're doing 30% by 2030 and looking at Finland's impact on biodiversity, it's largely like 80% or more is because of consumption patterns. So, and for Canada, I mean, when most of what we're consuming, and we are profligate consumers, is manufactured overseas. So what are the impacts if we're demanding cobalt, and cobalt is being mined by children in Africa? What is that? And pushing biodiversity out of the way for minerals. So it's a more complicated effort than we're going to take out a map and say this much. You also have to bear in mind, a lot of Indigenous peoples here are concerned. Does that mean that 30% of the land base has to have no people on it? Do you dispossess, again, Indigenous people from their lands in order to preserve biodiversity? And there's a real effort to talk about the corridors you mentioned. Certainly in Canada, it makes sense. We've been talking about the need for connected, contiguous ecosystem linkages in Canada for decades because of the climate crisis, but that isn't always the case in other countries around the world. They don't have, they're not looking at the north-south corridors. They're looking at elevation. What happens to alpine meadows? There's no place for those ecosystems to go. So in terms of climate and biodiversity, there are so many ways in which they're interrelated. In terms of the goal, 30% by 2030, the biggest obstacle is going to be that those repositories of biodiversity, which have the most potential for us to set aside and preserve, are in developing countries where it's simply not possible for biodiversity to be set aside without financing to ensure that those countries are compensated for what they give up in development.
Yeah, I think that's a key factor is that biodiversity, sort of species richness and species abundance is very non-uniform across the planet. So, we have these biodiversity hotspots. So if we protected those, like the Amazon rainforest is probably the best example. And we've seen what's been happening the last several years with the Amazon rainforest. So I haven't heard anything at this conference yet about the rainforest, for example. If we lose the Amazon rainforest and there's all these cascading feedbacks and we lose a huge carbon sink on the planet. Biodiversity, protecting it is vital for maintaining carbon sinks on the planet, for example. So have you heard any discussions at all about specific points like the Amazon rainforest at this conference?
Well, many. I mean, the Amazon. There's also, again, the continent of Africa is being courted with a lot of investments from China. They're not interested at this point. The Chinese money that's flowing into African nations is not looking at preserving biodiversity. It's looking at rare minerals, and getting cobalt, lithium and we're driving an increase in that. Driving, no pun intended, in the demand for electric vehicles, and we can't allow the demand for electrifying everything to be conflated with child labor and inappropriate practice. But I mean, one of the things within forests too, peatlands in terms of carbon, and that would the protection of peatlands and those peatlands that are within forests within Africa is something we haven't talked about very much at all in environmental dialogues within Canada. We absolutely have to protect looking more domestically. We have to protect our old growth forests in Canada, and yet we still are allowing, as in British Columbia, we have only 2% of our old growth forest left on Vancouver Island, and the BC government approved logging in Fairy Creek. We have a large slab of a stump that's on display in these halls that was brought here from British Columbia. And delegates from other countries are absolutely stunned to imagine that trees of that size are still legally logged in Canada while we proclaim we're champions of biodiversity. We still have hundreds of square kilometers of forests are still being clear cut within our boreal. We're not acting with urgency to protect forests in Canada, nor are we acting with urgency to plant forests in Canada. So it's our linkages between climate and biodiversity, the overwhelming similarities between the issues is that governments talk a good line and then don't do anything.
Yeah, and the press conference that you just had is actually a very interesting example, because here we are in Montreal, and just north of the Montreal airport is a vital wetlands with over 200 species of birds. And it's slated for, a lot of it is slated to be lost and developed. So do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, I've been working on this with a wonderful group of grassroots activists here in Montreal for a number of years now. So I think I first went bird watching in the lands adjacent to the Montreal airport in a place called Technopark about 3 years ago, and was astonished. I mean, really extremely endangered species, and lots of appeals to various ministers, starting with asking Catherine McKenna when she was Environment Minister to act under the Species at Risk Act to protect these species. And the federal government, even though this is federal jurisdiction, airport and Technopark next to it, and some of it is federal land leased to the airport, there's been a complete unwillingness to act. As Clifford Lincoln, former Environment Minister for Quebec and former Liberal MP, was just saying at our press conference, when the airport authority didn't get what it wanted at one point, in a fit of pique, they destroyed areas that had 4,000 milkweed plants, which is critical habitat for monarch butterflies. So it's the hypocrisy of our position as a country that hosts a biodiversity summit. We don't just host this meeting. Canada is the host nation for the secretariat that supports the Convention on the Protection of Biological Diversity. We've been that since 1995. When I just mentioned Clifford Lincoln, he'd been the head of the delegation to COP2 in Jakarta. I was on that delegation working to try to boost the Biodiversity Convention, boost support for it, and Canada promised the world about what a great secretariat we would be. This is the first time we've hosted anything here, but Canada's hosting of this meeting is complicated by the fact that we're not the head of we're not running the negotiations. The presidency of this COP is China, but our record is reason we decided to do a press conference on Technopark and the endangered wetlands there is what could be more startling than that there's threatened biodiversity on the island of Montreal, and we can't get any level of government to step up and save it.
So the COP27 in Egypt, and that I was attended, it did have some successes, right, on loss and damage. So the idea that the countries that are most affected by climate are the developing countries, and it's the developed countries that have put all the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And as you've mentioned, many of the biodiversity spots are in the developing countries. So, it's very much connected. I mean, did you get some hope, or what's your feelings on COP27 outcome? And I guess, I think you've mentioned finance is one of the biggest sticking points of having a successful outcome to this biodiversity conference. So maybe I'll ask you about those two things. I mean, are you hopeful that something will be, it's just in the next few days. This conference goes till Monday, the December 19th. And then, so are we going to see breakthroughs or not? I mean, who knows, but are you hopeful?
Well, first I'll talk about Sharm el-Sheikh. I wasn't there because of it. The only reason I've been at so many COPs on climate, many more climate COPs than I've been to biodiversity COPs, but the COP26 in Glasgow ended with countries basically gasping to say, we're not giving up, we're going to keep moving. We've got, 1.5 is hanging by a thread, or 1.5 degrees is still possible, but the it's still alive, but the pulse is weak. I mean, that was the language at the very closing plenary of COP26 in Glasgow. I wasn't there only because I was in the Green Party leadership contest, and unfortunately, it ended November 19th, so I couldn't have been in Sharm el Sheikh. It wouldn't have worked out. But my colleague, my very close colleague, Mike Morris, Green MP for Kitchener Centre, had been with me in Glasgow, so was able to pick up and know what the work was at COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh. It was completely disappointing, of course. The host government makes a big difference. So having the host government be Egypt, and with all the human rights abuses happening all around us, wasn't propitious. But United Arab Emirates isn't going to be great for next year either, so we're very concerned. And the Loss and Damage Fund was initially put forward in the Warsaw COP. In 2013 in Warsaw, as the conference began, Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. And the head of the Philippine delegation, Yeb Sanyo, went on a hunger strike for all 2 weeks. A lot of us joined him in solidarity, and we're hunger striking for the whole 2-week COP. It was not particularly easy with that additional strain, but for the Philippine delegation, particularly the lead negotiator didn't know if his family was alive or dead because of the impact of Typhoon Haiyan. That's where loss and damage came up. It's taken all this time from 2013 to 2022 to acknowledge that the so-called Warsaw mechanism on loss and damage could be a fund. We have a lot of other funds that recognize that developing countries get hit harder by climate, but this one is specific and different. This one says the industrialized world caused that storm that just wiped out our country, and you owe us the money. So loss and damage is a much tougher principle, harder to get the fund built up around it. It's a very, very small step of progress when we're in a situation where clearly the IPCC has said we lose 1.5 or 2 degrees unless global emissions peak and fall rapidly well before 2025. So it's not as though we can just focus on making up for writing the checks for the damage we've caused. We've got to arrest the damage we're causing, or there simply is a level of climate crisis, I don't need to tell you, to which there is no recovery, which is unstoppable and self-accelerating. And we haven't avoided that yet at all. And Canada's on the wrong side of that issue. So Sharm el Sheikh was insufficient. And at this point in the climate crisis, we can't afford insufficient climate negotiations, nor can we afford a failure here in Montreal for biodiversity.
In the scientific literature, scientists are well known for their reticence, and also, scientists are specialized and they're often reluctant to talk about anything outside of their specialty. We need more system thinkers, more people that can connect all the dots. And there has been a number of papers in the last few years, papers which such name as, the end game of climate and things like that. And they're painting an ever direr, sort of honest picture view by climate scientists. So this is, I think it's a big problem when the climate scientists are the ones most concerned about what's happening. It's taking a long time for the rest of the world to catch up, but it's, I think, as we just continue along the path, we're going to, have simultaneous failure of crop growing regions on the planet and global food shortages, price spikes. I think that's almost inevitable, I would say, within 5 to 10 years. And the other thing is it really annoys me about these negotiations and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UN is this idea of 1.5. Maintaining 1.5 is absolutely absurd. We're going to be hitting 1.5 by 2030. And if you just follow the trend lines, 2 by 2040. So I don't think it's honest for people to be talking about maintaining 1.5 and 2. That's, and there's many scientists that feel that way now.
I know it's very, very hard to imagine there's any hope of holding to 1.5. But in terms of my work in Parliament, I'm dealing with people. I'm surrounded by liberals because I sit on, because it's a minority government, I don't get a choice of where I sit. And I'm surrounded with the talking points. that we are going to get to net zero by 2050. Net zero by 2050 is a fraud, and it's a very dangerous delusion that there's some kind of timeline that lets us sort of at a 45-degree angle go from now down to 2050 and a smooth landing. This is disruptive, it's dangerous, and holding to 1.5 may not be possible. Maybe holding to 1.7, 1 point, every increment, every fraction of a degree represents millions of lives. So we have to fight hard to say in Canada, we're on the wrong side of this. We have to break through, which unfortunately, most of our mainstream media has no idea. They actually think that net zero by 2050 is a bold goal. I don't see I don't see it. I don't hear it in Parliament, any of the other parties holding the Liberals to account that what they're saying about they have a plan to hold to net zero by 2050 if that's meaningful, and then announce that we're going to allow drilling at Bay du Nord and put the continued effort into building the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which we now own, which is halfway built, but the half that remains to be built, speaking of biodiversity, is in the most dangerous and pristine areas and dangerous in terms of construction. And they're going to be so Canada's position is so wrong-headed. We have got to be more radical in our statement to government, and we've got to call out the lies that when the Liberals say, we're climate leaders because we're putting money into helping you get a heat pump. That's a good thing to do. We'll help you get an electric car plug-in. Good thing to do. But they're putting far more money and far more resources into new fossil fuel infrastructure, new fossil fuel development, like in Bay du Nord. We should ban fracking immediately, cancel Trans Mountain, and reverse Bay du Nord, and then we begin to perhaps be able to create additional momentum globally for other countries to stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure and searching out new sources of unburnable carbon. So it's almost a moot point how bad it is inevitably. We have to fight like hell to avoid the worst, and we still have time to avoid the worst. I do believe we do, but not on current trajectories and not on current levels of media awareness. I think media awareness is one of our big obstacles, because the public is very worried. When you talk to individuals, when they look at what happened in BC last year, they look at what happened in Atlantic Canada this year, that people are increasingly aware that this is catastrophic, and that's at 1.1 degrees Celsius. We don't want to know how unsafe 1.5 degrees Celsius is. It's dangerous, 2 degrees even more so. There are massive tipping points even at 1.5 degrees. So whether we can avoid 1.5 or not, I think you're likely very right that we can't avoid it anymore. But as long as the IPCC says, and knowing that it's a negotiated document and very conservative and always underestimates how bad the impacts are going to be and always overestimates how much time we have, that should make us more prepared to say that if we're not able to get, the NDP have given the Liberals a free ride till 2025, a blank check for 4 budgets and not a single climate condition in it. We have to be much clearer about the threats, the urgency, and that the other parties are living in a dream world where they think they can get away either with calling themselves climate leaders or joining Pierre Poilievre and just beating the drum on reducing all taxes.
Yeah, the root cause of the problem is fossil fuel emissions, and we continue to have massive subsidies, and these subsidies actually even went up after the COVID pandemic. And at COP27, there were 700 fossil fuel lobbyists at the COP. Are you aware of any fossil fuel lobbyists at this particular COP? That'll sort of be my last question, I think.
There are a lot of lobbyists here for industries that destroy biodiversity. So pesticide lobby is here in force, biotech, and genetically modified organisms. I haven't seen a full list of who's here at COP. I'd be very surprised if fossil fuel lobbyists weren't here as well, because when you look around the world, the biodiversity, the Okavango Delta, for example, a Canadian company wants to be drilling for natural gas in one of the World Heritage sites, one of the biodiversity hotspots of Africa, looking at the Congo, looking at the Democratic DRC. There are many biodiversity hotspots that are threatened by oil and gas developments. So you're bound to be seeing a lot of oil lobbyists here as well. But the ones that have surfaced are the ones that traditionally have been obstacles on the Biodiversity Convention, which would be pharmaceutical lobby, biotech, and pesticides.
Well, thank you very much. I've been speaking with Elizabeth May, a member of Parliament and leader of the Green Party, and I'm Paul Beckwith. And thank you to all our viewers and followers on climateemergencyforum.org. And please subscribe and like our videos so that we can get the word out to more and more people. So thank you again, Elizabeth.